It's June the 16th, 2021, and our reading in 1 Samuel today is chapter 30. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and the 600 men with him came to the Bezor ravine, where some stayed behind, for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, "To whom do you belong and where do you come from?" He said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." He led David down, and there they were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling, because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder, or anything else they'd taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, and who were left behind at the Bezor ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them, but all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All shall share alike." David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." He sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, to those in Aroah, Sifmoth, Estimoa, and Rakal, to those in the towns of the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites, to those in Hormah, Bor, Ashan, Athach, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where David and his men had roamed. Amen. Well, getting back home now to Ziklag, David is faced with one of the greatest calamities of his life. The total destruction of Ziklag by the Amalekites. In verse 3, they'd burnt it by fire, it says, and also it goes on to say, and they'd taken away their wives and sons and daughters as captives. The awful plunder of their home then leads to a pouring out of grief, of course. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. But more than that now, his own men are poisoned by this grief. It says, each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. And that poisoning of grief leads them then to, this is the possibility of what could happen, to turn on David. They are blaming him, surely. And verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. This is the greatest calamity of David's life to this point, maybe in the whole of his life. But at the end of verse 6, but David found strength in the Lord his God. I want to suggest to you, this is also one of the greatest verses or statements in the whole of the Bible, and especially about David facing such an enormous problem and experiencing such great pain. It's one of the greatest verses that tells us so much about David, and it's a great turning point in this story. How can we, faced with problems, faced with pain, how can we experience a turning point? How do we persevere and press through that pain? And how can we prosper again? Here's the key: finding strength in the Lord his God. How did he do that? Exactly what that involved. That's something so deeply personal. That's something so individual, so unique to every one of us. But the principle is there. The point is made. God is the answer. We must turn to him. And then we have certain things that flow out of that kind of reinforce and deepen this experience of finding strength in God. He prayed, verse 7, although he prayed in a very special way. David inquired of the Lord. So he's seeking God's plan, God's purpose for the next step. How different, by the way, from Saul. When he was faced with tremendous difficulties, what did he do? Yes, he did turn to the Lord, but finding a closed door, he then inquires of the witch. Remember, in chapter 28, David had consistently, every step of his life, inquired of the Lord, and he does it certainly in the face of this great trial, humbly seeking God's will, putting himself into the hands of God. Quickly then, God's provision is made known to him. Verse 11, he finds this Egyptian who had been working with the Amalekites. He'd been part of the raiding party that had gone to Ziklag and now has been abandoned by the Amalekites. He's half dead. He's absolutely famished. So there's obviously a provision for him. He's given food and drink and he revives again. But then he's God's provision for David and his fighting men, because the Egyptian can lead them precisely to where they need to go to the Amalekite camp. And when they get there, God then gives David great power. Power without and power within. The power without is the power to fight against the Amalekites, to exterminate them, to wipe them out, And verse 18, David recovered everything. Everything the Amalekites had taken, he gets back. And amazingly, at the end of verse 20, they say, this is David's plunder. The plunder of the Amalekites is now called David's plunder. So he's given this great military, physical power without to conquer the Amalekites, but also he's given great power from within, verse 23. He's given sensitivity, he's given authority, and he's given wisdom to deal with these grumbling men amongst his own troops. And that kind of wisdom and that kind of authority and generosity of spirit, the ability to deal with people, that's also seen right at the end, verse 26, when David arrives back in Ziklag, and it says he sends some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. Again, that present that is sent to his friends. How generous, how wise is this man, David. So whatever the pain, the answer is always the same. You might be going through some terrible calamity in your life today, or it might hit you tomorrow or next week. This is life in this world. These are the ups and downs of human experience. Even as a believer, even for King David, what's the answer? He found strength in the Lord his God. Or the New Testament equivalent, Philippians 4:13. I can do everything through him, through Christ, who gives me strength.